Welcome to Understanding Wood Movement. In all of the travels doing seminars about woodworking, I found that one thing that most woodworkers ask me about is, what about compensating for wood movement, that creep that wood has? Well, I thought I'd try to explain a few of the areas about that and help you understand how it works and how you can apply it to the projects you build. I'll also show you a few of the mistakes I made along the way, and hopefully that'll help you be a better woodworker. Let me direct your attention over here for a minute. And this is not exactly the best drawing, but it does show you a couple of things. First of all, imagine a log that's been cut. It is laying long like so, and the longest axis in the boards would be the longitudinal axis. That's an important thing to remember, because the longitudinal axis has the least amount of wood movement. And so when studs in a house are stood vertically, you don't expect much movement there. As we look at the end, if we could just look at a section view of this end and bring it down here, what I've shown you is two other axes. This R is what we call the radial axis, and it radiates from the center. There's also a tangential or tangent axis, which is tangent to the annular rings. This is real important because the tangential axis has the greatest amount of movement in wood. And in most cases, this is only a generalization, the tangential movement is twice the radial. In other words, it's twice as much movement across that board. Well, what's that mean to you? At this point, it may not mean much, but let me show you something. If we were to cut boards out of a tree, we could either quarter saw them or flat saw them. Now, in this case, the tangential axis is across the thickness. If this were a 3/4 inch piece, how much movement would there be? Not very much. If this were 4 inches wide and 3/4 inch thick, the tangential axis on both sides of that would cause a great amount of movement. Interestingly enough, when you look at hardwood floors in older homes, many of them were made with quarter sawn material. That allowed them to cope with the movement of the floor. And if you've ever seen a hardwood floor under a radiator where water dripped forever, the boards tended to hump and crown up. Hard to believe there'd be that much movement. Before we started this video today, I took this piece of 2x10, 2x12, and I cut a saw kerf down the middle. And for about 2 hours now, half of it's been in the water, the other half has been out. Before we're done, we're going to pull that out of the can and see if we can see the movement in this piece of wood to get an idea of what happens in a short period of time. Well, we've talked a little bit about that. Let me show you some boards that give you some examples of first quarter sawn, and again you can see the annular rings go from face to face or up and down. Flat sawn goes across the board like so. Here we see one with very tight annular rings. In other words, if you look at those rings, they're much closer together. This is more of a rift sawn, that is, that comes across at an angle. This movement would still be greater than this piece here. Now, there's something else about this that is important. As we look at the bands here, a band is considered one area. An annular ring is a light and dark area. That is to say, what we have when we add these two together is 1 year's growth. The lighter material is what we call the early wood, and it grows early in the year, spring, when there's a lot of rain. The late wood is the more resinous material. It grows late in the year as we get into July and August in our growing season, and maybe later depending on where you live. But what happens is those two make up a year's growth. In some trees, those rings are much closer together, which means the growth is slower. With slow growth wood, you have more density. In other words, the board weighs more even though it's the same species. So that has a lot to do with wear too. As you look at this piece, when we turn it up like so, you see that each one of those late wood areas, which are harder, the summer wood, will give you a more tough surface. On this piece, you can see that there are smaller bands, and the softer area, the early wood or spring wood, is much wider. Now, if you've ever walked across a hardwood, or a porch floor, you may have noticed the quarter sawn boards stay tough like this, whereas these will wear away. These are the ones that give you the splinters as you slide across the porch floor, because the wear of the softwood away from the harder area causes it to break away. Now, do all species have this pronounced a grain? Absolutely not. But these really exemplify those differences, and I think they're important to the understanding. Well, how does wood movement impact what we do? Let me give you an example or two. First of all, in gluing two boards together, we may choose to make a dovetail joint. If we glue these lightly, the movement of these boards across this way, or even thicker and thinner, will not impact very much because there's a mechanical type of joint here. That is, they lock together to begin with. There's quite a bit of strength in all but two axes here, one axis. The only axis where it's loose is when I pull away this way. Any other axis is accounted for. So the glue is really only holding them together on one axis. So this is one way that we cope with the movement of moisture. Let me show you another way, and that is in the making of a door. We call them frame and panel doors because we make a frame and enclose a panel. Now the panel that's in here is not glued in, it's free to move. And we made the grooves that it is inserted into much bigger than the amount of wood that's in here. This allows it to float or move around. So as the seasons change, it has free to move. Now, how would the seasons change and impact this? Well, when the heat comes on in the wintertime, it's much drier in the home. The outdoor air is so cold that it won't hold moisture. That means then that these pieces will give off moisture and shrink. Coming into the summer season, where I live, it's very humid, and what will happen is these boards will absorb water and swell or move again. You may have looked at a door and saw a white line here in the wintertime where the wood wasn't finished or stained, and what had happened is it shrunk past the area that had been stained originally in the building of the door. So when we put these together, we allow movement, and this is the longitudinal axis, so we don't need much. It's across the width that we need movement, and we've compensated for that. Now, also what we've done here is we know that the face grain has the strongest gluing, so by putting this tongue on here, we have face grain gluing. There's still some movement. In this case, it's the longitudinal axis, and in this case, it would be probably the tangential axis because it's flat sawn. If it were quarter sawn, then it would be the radial axis. There's more movement here, which means then that that's also why we cope that joint, or where it goes together and makes that line. As this board moves a little bit, that miter will still stay tight. Now, in a picture frame miter, things are a little bit different, and let me show you what happens there. Imagine this is the corner of a picture frame. If the moisture content is right and we glue this up, we'll have a nice picture frame corner like that. But let's suppose the moisture content of the wood was a little lower than we expected. Let's say we build it in the wintertime, now it's August, the humidity's high, and we start to see some growth. You may see this miter looking like this in the summertime. In other words, that point will still be tight, but it will open up slightly at that outer corner. And what's happened then is the movement of these two boards out this way, it can't move in because of that point. As it moves out, it leaves an open there. Now, if the miters were just the opposite, they would have shrunk, which means the moisture content was too high to begin with. Well, these are important things to think about, and that's why we specify moisture content of wood. What represents dry wood? Typically, we talk about 6 to 8% moisture content being ideal for woodworking. Now, there are drier parts of the country that might want a little lower, and humid parts where it might be a little higher. An example, a friend of mine built a home with wood that was about 8% moisture content, but his home was in a forest that had a canopy of trees over it that was so moist that all of the doors started to swell, and he found out that he was going to have to trim those. So moisture content is a relative thing depending on where you are. But we can get an idea of what the wood moisture content is when we purchase it with moisture meters such as this one. This one here has a scale on it that goes from 6 to 20% moisture content. There are two different scales on it depending on the properties of the wood. Most of the hardwoods that are domestic in this case are off the 2. And we can check a piece of wood to see what the moisture content is. You can see that the 6 is glowing, which tells me it's either 6% moisture content or slightly beneath that. In this case, that's ideal. Now, if I were to test this same piece in August. Right now it's February. If we were to test this in August, I would bet that it might be 7 or 8% because of the high humidity where I live. So there will be some changes in there. But as we select our wood, it's important to be at that level. Interestingly enough, the hardwoods we buy or will be at that level, but when we go to a lumber yard to buy softwood, our construction lumber, a 1x6, we might say these will be good for what we're doing. They too are kiln dried, but they're not dried to the same level. Most of them will be below 19%, and 19% is the magic number because that's the level at which it will not support things like termites or powder post beetles. So that's dry for construction. What you'll discover, though, is if you bring that wood inside and start to make cabinets out of it, you're going to have a lot of shrinkage because as you bring it into that heated area, it will lose moisture to the air and it will shrink much more than the hardwoods you buy. So moisture content in softwoods is generally higher and it will impact on your choices and planning of what you do. Allowing stock to float in a panel will help immensely. As we look at this panel, notice that the tangential area over here is much greater than it is over here. So we've actually got two cases in here. This was cut out of closer to the center of the tree and further out. So this is a combination of a rift or almost quarter sawn and a flat sawn. If we selected this and cut it here and used a number of these pieces, we'd have less movement. But this is about half of what it'd be if this was a totally flat sawn board. Each board has its own story. It tells it in the end grain as you look at it, and that's an important thing to do. Here's another example of a raised panel, and in this case we see a check in the end grain. What's happened here is we've given off more moisture off the end grain, and as this moved, it actually separated itself and checked. When you buy lumber from a lumber yard, hardwood or softwood, always look at the end grain. If you start to see some checks, come in about 4 inches and cut the board off because they may continue up that line if you don't account for that early in your construction. You may later discover something like this. The crack up here is right at the glue line. And it may have been an error in the gluing, or it might be just some movement because as we cut this raised panel, we exposed new areas and allowed some more shrinkage to occur if this was a little higher. Incidentally, the species here is beech, and it's known for quite a bit of movement. I'll show you another example. We made up 200 of these cutting boards, and they were designed to have a little swan wood burned into the top of them. And some of them were rejects. Case in point was this one. Everything down to about here was fine, but look what happened. Down here at the end grain, we found that after we sawed that arc out, and these were another 2 or 3 inches out, the end grain gave off some moisture and started to check or crack open. Now, I suppose I could repair this, but for now I'm using it as an example for wood technology and to understand some of this wood movement. That's another example of problems with wood movement. The corners on this box are kind of interesting. We're seeing this box joint is opening up and it's trying to crack on us a little bit, right up here and here. And what's happening is we glued a piece of wood across the top here, and as that shrinks, it's trying to lift that joint open and actually break it. It's hard to believe that there's that much stress that can be generated in a piece of wood, but that's exactly what's happening here. Once we cut this open, maybe the stress will relieve itself, but this may want to rock a little bit. We might have to trim it off to make it flat. So if we plan this differently and maybe put this inside a frame, such as in a frame and panel door, we might not have had that problem. So wood movement really impacts on a lot of the things we do. And it's important to allow for that movement. One final example here, I've cut this piece open, and this is actually a raised panel that was a flaw, and we ended up replacing it. But you can see that we've raised the panel, and I sawed this, and it's a beautiful joint that fits together well. Closer into the center here, the joint started to open at this end, and we had a little movement, and it may have been that the joint was really pressed to begin with. In other words, we really muscled down on the clamps more than we needed to close that. And then as the moisture content was given off, it started to separate. It looked really open at that one end, so maybe I could break it and get it back together by joining that edge. Well, as I broke it, we could see that the joint started to fail way up here, And you can see even where the stain had gone into that opening just a little bit. In other words, it wasn't a good glue joint until we got down to about here. Yet it was only obvious up here where the stain penetrated through the crack. As I tried to break it open, we see that the joint along this line was much stronger, and it only gave way along a weaker part of the wood grain. So this really wasn't a good thing to repair. It wasn't totally worthless. It's just a bad example. And that's why you're seeing it, to help learn a little bit about your planning. You can clamp stock too tightly and try to take that little bow out or that little space out. But when you do, that panel is dropped. The stresses that are in there can cause that to crack open. Remember, check the wood you're working with for moisture content if you're in doubt. Most reliable lumber dealers will provide you with wood that is at the right moisture content. But it's your duty then to check it and plan your work so that it will be compatible with the design. In other words, you want to allow for the movement of big boards so that they don't break the joinery. Let's take a look now to see what's happened with our little example or demonstration here. I don't know how well the camera will pick that up, but I see almost a 30-second of growth in about 2 hours of time. So if we were to leave this in over the weekend, it would actually be a 1/4 inch of growth there. It's hard to believe that wood will move that much, but this is a good example over a short period of time, and one that you might try at home just to see how much movement you'll get in the species you're working with. Well, that gives you a little bit to think about as far as planning your work and coping with moisture content and wood movement in the projects you build. But remember, to be a better woodworker, you have to do more woodworking, and I'd urge you to do that. If you've learned from this video and you want more information about the videotapes I have available on woodworking, please give me a call at 1-800-383-9067. We'll send you out a brochure, Jackrabbit Fast. Hope to hear from you soon.